If you think machine quilting feathers is difficult, then this video is for you. Hi, I'm Angela Walters from quiltingismytherapy.com, and I am so excited to show you just how fun and easy it is to machine quilt feathers by breaking them down to their basic components. I'm going to show you how to quilt them step by step, plus I'll share practical quilting tips and help you troubleshoot common frustrations. This is actually the first video in the Machine Quilting Feathers Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along video series. Throughout this free video series, I'm going to show you how to quilt feathers in all areas of your quilts, including blocks, skinny borders, backgrounds, and more. Whether you're an FMQ beginner wanting to learn the ropes, or a seasoned quilter looking for some design inspiration, this free video series is going to be perfect for you. And I'm going to be demonstrating the designs on this custom panel I designed just for the video series. It's the perfect way to get the experience of quilting a quilt top without having to take the time to actually make it. To learn more about the video series or to get the custom products, all you have to do is click the link in the description box below or visit quiltingismytherapy.com. But before we can learn how to use feathers in all areas of our quilts, we need to learn how they go together. Now, you probably noticed there's a lot of different ways to quilt feathers. But the good news is that they all boil down to the same basic components. It's just the way those components are quilted that gives them their different look. For the most part, all feathers have a spine, which acts as the center of the feather, and petals, which extend out from both sides. These petals are what gives it its beautiful feathery look. Once you get the hang of how to quilt those, then you can change them up and create tons of variations. Now, even though there are a million different ways to quilt feathers, in this video, I'm going to show you two of my favorites. We're going to be using these feathers throughout the video series to quilt the areas of our quilt. We're going to start off with what I like to call the classic feather. This feather doesn't have any backtracking, but it still has a beautiful curvy look. Then we're going to learn how to quilt the custom feather. This custom feather has a slightly different look thanks to one extra step. But even though it takes a little bit longer to quilt, the result is so worth the effort. Now, in this video series, all the techniques that we're going to be working with throughout all the videos can be done with any kind of feather. So if you already have a style of feather that you like to quilt, then you could definitely stick with that. But if you need a little bit of quilting inspiration, let me show you how fun it is to quilt these. So let's get started. This classic feather can be quilted in a lot of different ways, but I'm going to show you how I like to do it. So first, I'm going to start off with that spine. I'm going to quilt a gently wavy line that ends in a teardrop. That teardrop is going to act as the top of my feather, and so I kind of want it to be nice and rounded. Another thing that's really important about this feather is I want all the lines to look as though they're merging into the spine. This is key. If that line merges into the spine, it's going to make it look nicer and leave me room for my next petal. So as I come around that teardrop, I'm going to quilt it so it looks like it's merging back into that spine. Now don't stress out too much about how big this teardrop is. Just quilt that loop and make that line merge into the spine. Well, now that I have my spine and the top of my feather, it's time to start adding my petals. And those are those beautiful curvy things on the side that really gives it its beautiful curvy look. Now, as I'm quilting these petals, I'm kind of thinking of a half heart shape, a line that curves out and swoops back into that spine. So from this point, I'm going to quilt that line that curves out and back into the spine until I have something like this. Again, nice and curvy, it's merging into the spine, and that's gonna leave me set up for my next petal. So I can swoop right back out and come back into that spine. Now, depending on which way my spine is curving, I might have to quilt a little bit further to run into that spine, and that's totally fine. Just keep going until you run into it, making that line look as though it's merging into it. And I'm gonna keep doing that, working my way down that spine until I get to the bottom. And there we have the first half of our feather. We can see those petals are kind of lined up. There's not a bunch of gaps in between them, and they're nice and round and curvy and looking like they're merging into the spine. And that is what we're looking for. But a feather isn't a feather unless we put petals on both sides of it. So we need to do the same on the other side. Now, I prefer to quilt my petals from the top down. To me, that's just how I learned. So what I'm gonna do is echo back along that spine to get back to the top and add those petals on the other side. For echoing, I'm just quilting the same basic shape a set distance away. And I like to quilt my lines about a 1/4 inch apart because I can run the foot of my machine along the previously quilted line. The trick to echoing is looking ahead of the needle in the direction you're heading and trusting your hands to take you to there. Even if that line gets a little bit further apart or closer together, as long as it's smooth, it's gonna look great. And then once I get to the top of my feather, I can do the same thing I did on the other side, quilting those petals that swing out and merge back into the spine. Now, as I'm quilting these petals, let me tell you what I'm not worrying about. I'm not worried about having the same number of petals on both sides of the feather. Even if one side has a little bit more than the other, you're not really going to notice it. Another thing that's going to really help you get that big, beautiful feather is to extend that petal out into the space. I know when we're learning a new design, it can be tempting to quilt it small and kind of tiny, but feathers look better when they're big and beautiful. So really kind of try to extend it out into that space. When it comes to quilting feathers, when you're finished, the thing that's going to stand out is the unquilted area right here in the petals. So even if my lines are a little bit overlapped or they don't look quite right, it's going to look fine because once I'm done and I step back, all I'm going to see is that big, beautiful, curvy feather. Well, now that we've seen the basics of how this goes together, let's troubleshoot some common frustrations. Just as we've already seen, I'm going to start at the bottom of my feather and quilt that spine that goes up towards the top, ending in a teardrop. And it doesn't matter which side of the feather you start quilting first. In this example, I've ended on the right side of the feather, so that's the one I'm going to start quilting along. Again, quilting that line that curves out and scoops back into the spine. And here we can see that line is looking like it's merging into the spine, but sometimes things don't quite work out the way we want it to. For instance, let's say I'm quilting my petals and I get a line that looks more like it's intersecting, not merging. So what's happening here is that line looks like it's going to cross right over the spine. Not only does it not look quite right, but it doesn't leave me room for my next petal. If I can catch that in time, however, I'm just going to travel down the spine a little bit and resume quilting my petals. The best thing to do, especially when you're learning, is to keep going. Sometimes when we're learning how to quilt, we can make a mistake and kind of get all caught up on it. Instead of worrying about it, just keep on going, because I promise eventually it's going to click. Now, in the previous example, I used echoing to get back to the top of the feather because that's how I feel comfortable quilting it. However, if you don't like echoing or you want to leave a step out, you can actually quilt your petals from the bottom up. So right from here, I'm going to start quilting the other side by quilting a line that curves up and back in. But even though I'm starting with the bottom of the petal first, I still want it to look as though it's merging into that spine. Now, if you've ever quilted a feather before, you might have noticed that one side of the feather might look a little bit better than the other. Well, congratulations, you're completely normal. I find that most quilters have a dominant side, so we kind of find that one side of the feather looks better than the other. But don't let that frustrate you, because the more you practice, the more consistent it will get. Now, I've already kind of alluded to this, but a common frustration with quilting feathers is making those petals too small. Remember, what's going to stand out is this unquilted area in the petal, and that's what gives it its beautiful look. So if you find that you're quilting your petals a little bit on the smaller side, maybe taking a marking pen and marking a few of those will help you see how big you should quilt them. Now, what I love about feathers, and really any quilting design, is that you can change it up to fit your preferences. So for example, we know I like to quilt my petals from the top down, but you could do yours from the bottom up. Or instead of doing one side and the other, you can switch in between the two. I'm not trying to overwhelm you with options. I'm just trying to show you that you can switch it up and make it fit your preferences. So let me show you what that one looks like. Of course, it's going to start off the same way with my spine and my teardrop on the top. Then from here, I'm going to quilt that first petal on one side of it. But instead of continuing on down that side, I'm going to pause and quilt a petal on the other side. Then I'm going to keep doing that, working my way down the spine, quilting a petal on each side until I get to the bottom. Now, the benefit to quilting a feather like this is that I don't have to go up and back and up and back. I can go up, quilt my petals, and return back to where I started. So you might want to experiment with that and see if you like it. Now, as you're practicing this design and quilting it out, try not to get frustrated if it doesn't turn out exactly how you want it to. I promise that with repetition, it's going to get more and more comfortable. Well, now that we've seen some different ways of quilting the classic feather, let's see how to quilt that custom feather that has one extra itty-bitty step. Now, I love the custom feather because it has this beautiful, elegant look, and it just really kind of epitomizes what a feather should look like. Now, even though this feather is made up with the same basic components as the classic feather, we're quilting them in a different way. For this feather, the petals stack up from the bottom. So when I start by quilting the spine, I'm going to start from the top of where I want the feather to be and quilt that spine towards the bottom. Again, quilting that gently curvy line. Once I get to the bottom of my feather, it's time to start adding those petals. They're quilted in groups of 2. One of the petals is going to swing out and then backtrack, and the second petal is going to come back in. So think of these kind of in groups of 2. One goes out, and one comes back in. Since I'm quilting this feather out in the middle of nowhere, I don't really have anything to stack my first petal on, but I'm just gonna quilt it and stop once I get kind of even with that spine. So here's my first petal. It's kind of going out, curving, and if there were something else down here, this would be touching that thing. Now from this point, this is where we're gonna see that traveling come into play. I'm gonna back up along that line I just quilted, and then quilt a line that curves out and back into that spine. So there's my back tracking right there, and the second petal is gonna swing out and come back in. One common thing that quilters will do is we'll kind of forget to swing out. We'll kind of just come back in, and in that case, it looks kind of just like an echo line. I really wanna make sure I swing out so I have that same curvy petal. And I still want that petal to look like it's merging into the spine. Now with this feather, it's not quite as important because it's not gonna affect the next petals, but I think it makes it look a little bit better. So as you're quilting, try to focus on making it merge into that line. Now we can see our first group of 2 petals, that one going out, backtracking, swooping out, and coming back in. And we're gonna keep doing that, quilting those petals in groups of 2. So from this point, I'm gonna travel along that spine just a little bit and swing out and quilt my next petal. And then I'm gonna backtrack along that to add the next one. Now one question that comes up quite often with this is how far do I need to travel back along that petal? The distance I travel here is going to depend on whether my petals are getting bigger or smaller. And for right now, I want to keep them somewhat the same size. So if I touch the previous petal right here, I'm going to echo around it until I'm directly above it. For the most part, I'm trying to keep them somewhat even, but as you're practicing the design, don't worry about that. That's something that will work itself out with practice. And then as I approach the top of my feather, I tend to make my petals a little bit smaller just to kind of give it a more rounded look. Of course, that's totally optional. You don't have to worry about that. And there I have the first half of my feather, and now it's time to do the same on the other side. But remember, since these petals stack from the bottom up, I need to get to the bottom of my feather, and to do that, I'm going to echo along the spine back to that point. Another reason I like to have an echoed spine right here is it helps separate the 2 sides of my feather. Sometimes as we start quilting, if we get a lot of thread buildup in one area, it can be really noticeable. This echo line just gives it a little bit of separation and helps kind of keep them away from each other a little bit. Now that I'm at the bottom of my feather, it's time to do the same thing, quilting those petals in groups of 2. Okay, let's talk about this traveling for just a second. It's almost kind of a joke, right? It's tricky enough to quilt that petal the first time, and then to hit it the second time, ugh. One thing that I find helpful with that is I don't pause before I do my traveling. What that means is as I quilt my petal around, I don't stop and worry about it and then backtrack. Instead, I come in and then backtrack right away. I'm going to use the muscle memory to kind of help me keep those lines pretty close. But here's the good news. Even if that line comes a little bit off of that and you don't have quite a travel line, you have more of an echo line, it is totally fine. Once I come back later and put other stuff around it, you're not gonna notice it. So don't let that frustrate you, especially if your traveling lines aren't perfect. I know I say it a lot, but I promise, once that whole area is filled in, it's gonna look great. Now, just like the previous feather, I'm not worried about having the same number of petals on both sides of that feather, and I'm also not worried about whether my rows of petals line up with each other. I feel like we have enough stuff to worry about with this design without throwing all that other stuff in there. Instead, focus on making your lines merge into the spine, and be sure that you're not quilting those petals too small. Just like that previous feather, this one looks best when it's big and beautiful and curvy. And when I'm done, I have my beautiful custom feather. I love how those petals look like they're stacking on top of each other, and that's what gives it that beautiful, elegant look. Now, let's troubleshoot some common frustrations with this one. So just like we've already seen, I've quilted my spine, and now it's time to start adding my petals on one side. So here's kind of the ideal with this feather. I want those petals to be nice and wide. I want them to look like they're stacking on top of each other and merging into that spine. But sometimes it doesn't go quite as planned. So let me show you what some of those frustrations might be. One common thing that I see newer quilters do is not travel back enough along this petal so we can add the next one. Or we'll forget to quilt that next petal so that it swings out and comes back in. If that happens, we'll get something that looks a little bit like this. So what I should have done differently is I should have quilted this so it came out a little bit more and then back into that spine. Since I cut off that part of it, it's a little bit skinnier and not quite the same size as the other ones. Now, if this happens to you, don't worry about it. Keep on going. It's going to be fine. But just remember, as I'm quilting that petal that comes back into the spine, I want to make sure that I swing out enough and come back in. Now let's go on the other side of the feather and see another common frustration. Now I know I keep saying merge, merge into that spine, but it is so key with this design. That's what gives it that beautiful kind of curvy look and helps kind of draw your eye to the center. But sometimes we forget and we might quilt our lines so they look like they're intersecting that instead of merging into it. While it's not technically incorrect and it's totally fine, it's just not going to have that same kind of elegant look. So again, as I'm quilting those petals, I'm really trying to make it look as though it's merging into that spine. But here's the deal. If I'm quilting my feather and some of them aren't quite right, or some of my petals don't quite merge into the spine, it's still gonna look fine. Once you step back, you're still gonna see that beautiful curvy feather. So the trick here is you have to keep going. Even if you feel like you made a mistake or you're not loving how it's looking, keep going. Because it's when you see that whole feather that you realize that everything kind of blends into each other. Now, like we saw with the classic feather, you can change up how you go about this design. So let me show you what that looks like. I'm still gonna quilt that spine so it starts from the top of my feather on down to the bottom. And I'm gonna quilt my first set of petals where it goes out, travels, and one comes back. This time though, instead of continuing on along that spine, I can stop and quilt 2 petals on the other side of my feather. And then repeat, going from one side to the other, quilting those petals in groups of 2. This is especially helpful for those longer, thinner borders that we don't want to have to keep repositioning the quilt. In fact, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in the next video. I will say that newer quilters might find this a little tricky since we're alternating directions. Sometimes when we're trying to quilt those designs that mirror each other, it can be a little bit tricky. But you should give it a try and see if you like it. Now, another thing I want to point out is when I'm quilting on a sewing machine, I like to quilt in a vertical motion. Now, one of the drawbacks to that though is I can't always see where I'm going. If that kind of trips you up, you might find it easier to quilt horizontally. Everybody is different, so you just have to try both and see which one feels a little bit more comfortable for you. Now, if you're quilting on a long arm, you don't have the luxury of changing the orientation of your quilt. You're gonna have to learn how to quilt those feathers in all different directions, from up and down and side to side and vice versa. The best thing I can suggest is to learn how to quilt the feather first and then learn how to quilt it in all different directions. So for instance, if I feel more comfortable quilting that feather from left to right, I'm gonna keep doing that until I get the hang of how it goes together, and then I'm gonna try quilting it in all different directions. It may take a little bit longer, but I promise once you get the hang of it, you'll be whipping them around in all different directions in no time. So if you're wanting to add an elegant look to your quilting, the custom feather might be just perfect for you. No matter which style of feather you prefer, these designs are perfect for adding an elegant look to your quilting. Whether you go with the classic feather that has that nice, curvy, beautiful look, or you bump it up a bit with the custom feather, adding a little bit of backtracking. So now it's your turn. If you're quilting along with me throughout the video series, go ahead and practice these designs on a quilt sandwich. You can try out both of the feathers, you could create your own feather variations, or you could just pick one and stick with it. Because all the designs that we're gonna be learning throughout this video series can be quilted with any kind of feather. And as always, I've put together some free quilting diagrams to help you be successful with the designs that we're learning. Or if you want even more in-depth instruction, you can check out the expanded resource PDF. It has step-by-step instructions, more diagrams, and even more quilted pictures. For less than $10, it has everything you need to be successful with the designs that we're going to be learning throughout the video series. To find out more about either one of those, all you have to do is click the link in the description box below or visit quiltingismytherapy.com. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to take that feather and use it to create designs that are perfect for thinner sashings and borders. Until then, everybody, happy quilting!